Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the 92nd Street Y for having us. Michael and Jess, I'm just going to let you introduce yourselves, I guess in that order. So Michael, if you'd like to, you're on this side of my screen, so I'm gesturing as though that means something, but
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Sebastian. I'm the editor in chief of Esquire, and I'm thrilled to be here and excited to be talking about this. And it's a real pleasure.
thank you so much. And Jess.
Hi guys, I'm Jess. I'm the editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan. Really excited to be here. Love the 92nd Street Y. Love talking about sex, especially with my friends Haylin and Michael. So yeah, looking forward to this.
Yes, I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. As a sexuality educator, I'm lucky enough that my job in general is to get to talk about sex for money. It's a true blessing. But to get to talk about it with y'all and to get to talk about this topic specifically feels particularly exciting. In case you forgot on your way here while we were introducing ourselves, we're here specifically to talk about not just sex, but sex in the sort of post-pandemic or kind of intra-pandemic world, specifically sort of growing out of a survey that Esquire and Cosmopolitan put out in partnership with the Kinsey Institute. So I don't know if one of you feels most excited to talk about how this project came about, but I'd love to hear a little bit about the partnership between Esquire and Cosmo. Feels a little bit more obvious, but how the Kinsey Institute got involved.
You know what? I'll start, and Jess, if you want to jump in after that. Last year, I got really curious about the basically the sex lives of the guys that I hang out with. And most of them are like me, married or partnered up with kids. Some of them are single. And, we've just been going through this obviously extraordinary time. And nobody really wanted to talk about it. And I guess that's just a guy thing, right? We talked about all kinds of things. We talked about music and sports and kids and you name it, but we weren't talking about our sex lives. And I thought, well, fuck it. I have Esquire at my disposal. Why don't we bring that to bear? And then, as it turns out, Jess, who I've been friends and colleagues with for many years, and I were talking. And as it turns out, Cosmo was doing a survey about sex during the pandemic and post-pandemic. And so we just decided to team up, and it felt natural having these two iconic brands, one an authority on sex and on Gen Z millennial women, another an authority on men in America. And why not get the two of them together? And Jess, you can kind of talk to us about how Kinsey got involved, I believe.
Yeah, it was just a very synergistic thing. We work in the same building, Michael and I and our teams. And naturally, as two groups who were focused on sort of opposite sides of the relationship equation, we found that we were thinking the same thoughts, asking the same questions. And we wanted to bring in Kinsey because what more reputable organization to work with to conduct a survey about sexuality in America. We have a great relationship with Kinsey, really respect them. They brought a lot to the table in terms of, making sure that our data was nationally representative and that we were asking the right questions to get the right information. And the key there was that we did not want to do a story about what happened during COVID, because we felt like, you know what, by the time we're near the end of COVID, we might all be sick of hearing about what happened during COVID. And we might all have our own guesses and very different stories to tell. So we really wanted to look forward and see what's coming for us next. This is a time when every day brings something different. It's been a scary time. Today, it feels like there's great news, but it's been unpredictable. And so we wanted to give people a sense of predictability. Like, here's what's coming, here's what to prepare for. And so we decided to prognosticate a little bit and felt confident in doing so with a partner like Kinsey.
I think that's an understandable instinct, given that, it feels like the last year, for at least I'll speak for myself, has felt sort of like holding my breath in a lot of different dimensions of life. So having the opportunity to actually talk about any future, let alone the kind of optimistic future that I think this survey lays out, in my opinion, is certainly very exciting. Also, just a little fun sex educator fact for y'all. My very first AOL Instant Messenger like screen name was OK Dr. Kinsey, because I was a little 13-year-old very excited about Alfred Kinsey's sexological research. So snaps to the Kinsey Institute. So getting into what that survey actually bore out, I was pretty surprised myself, for a couple of reasons. That one of the big findings was that people were coming out of the pandemic really interested in committed relationships. And this might sound silly to say, but part of the reason I was surprised was, are y'all on TikTok? Are you like
Yes.
TikTokers? Okay, that sound, the streets are calling my name, right? I feel like that's extraordinarily popular. That sentiment feels extraordinarily popular. I feel like my friends just anecdotally are like, oh yeah, summer 2021 is going to be like the horniest summer of all time. Which, you know, people always talk a lot more game than they're necessarily interested in living in their day-to-day life. But what do you make of that discrepancy between the expectation and the apparent reality?
Yeah, it's, it caught us by surprise too. I was fully expecting, an absolute bacchanalia free-for-all this summer. And I was also expecting that the couples that quarantined together would break up en masse. I really expected a lot of breakups and divorces to come out of COVID because of the stress and because of the tension and the fact that you're stranded in a house or an apartment with someone that you haven't been spending that much time with. And so, and by the way, yes, I am drinking a cocktail because this is a cocktail event and I hope you guys have cocktails too. Yeah, we were honestly quite pleased to see that the data pointed in a different direction. And the sort of broad strokes of that direction are, the data pointed to the fact that the single people who were quarantined as singles are actually not as interested in excessive hookups or in a lot of one-night stands. What they're more interested in is finding a partner, finding a committed relationship when they go back out into the world. And there's a sweetness to that. I'm a softy romantic at heart, and so that was sweet to me. And then the other thing it really pointed to is the fact that couples who were quarantined together actually got closer and felt more intimate. 69% of the men that we surveyed said that they feel more affection for their partner than they did before COVID. And honestly, both of those things feel positive and promising to us.
Yeah, I think just to bounce off what Jess said, as I had imagined that the headlines here would be exactly as everyone else probably imagined it, which was that it was going to be a sexual free-for-all, and that it was also going to be just breakups and divorce all over the place. And I think that as journalists, it is always delightful to be surprised when this information comes back and it's not what you expected it to be. And I too was very surprised at the data that we saw. And yet the more that we thought about it and the more reporting that we did when we talked to people and we talked to both everyday people and then sex educators and so on, it really seemed to bear that out in ways where, unless we had done this research, I don't think we would have come to this conclusion. And I think it's very interesting and but also makes sense and is quite provocative.
Yeah, I've heard people call it apocalypsing, this idea that like waking up every day and feeling like the world is ending kind of forces people to look at their priorities differently, maybe, or look at their relationship with a new perspective. It does sort of make sense as a single person why, especially I'm just thinking about my single friends who lived in New York throughout this last year and the experience of, kind of like, I'm losing it in here by myself. We really love to have any person around, really, especially a person that I really liked. What does apocalypsing look like when you're already in the relationship? Is it just the same thing of like, wow, I really want to make sure that you don't go anywhere because it would really suck to not have you around? Or is it a little bit different when it's in an established partnership?
I one of the experts that we talked to for this piece, she she brought the term mortality salience to the table, which I really appreciated hearing. And it's exactly that concept of, the finality of life striking you such that it makes you reassess where you spend your time and energy so that you can appreciate what you have while you have it. I personally have sort of run the gamut of COVID experiences. I started out COVID single. I dated during COVID. Last summer, there was like 1 week in New York City when it was warm enough to go outside and have a drink, and cases were down, and everyone felt like, let's get out there and meet a few people. And now I'm in a long-term relationship, and so I've really run the gamut, which has been fascinating. But Michael, I know that you have been quarantined in a marriage, and I think you can speak to this quite well.
Yeah, so I'm the opposite of Jess in that I'm married. I have 2 young daughters, and there's a couple of statistics from this that come to mind, and I don't want to necessarily bore people with numbers, but I do think that they're interesting because you mentioned, Jess, the 69% of men surveyed reported they feel more affectionate towards their partners. But then there's also one that, according to our survey, only 2% of people who fantasize about leaving their partners actually intend to split. 68% are less likely to cheat. So it's good numbers when it comes to people in relationships. And I think, personally, all of this makes sense to me because before the pandemic, my wife and I, who was also working, we were going in a million different directions. We had our jobs, and we had our social life, and we had our kids to think about, and everything else. And then we had this period of we were forced together in a way. And instead of tearing us apart, I think it really made us, it strengthened us. I don't mean to sound Pollyannish about the whole thing, because of course, there were times when we were fighting or bickering over things, but it did kind of make us feel like, okay, we got through this together, and now, we're coming out of it stronger. Now, all of that said, nothing kills the libido like having 2 little kids around all the time. So I think that maybe single people fared better when it came to that, I suppose.
Potentially. I also know people who didn't go on a date for a whole year. So
but the interesting thing to point out about singles is that one of the other silver linings, I think, to come out of this is that COVID helped destigmatize self-pleasure. It helps destigmatize masturbation, especially for women, because Haylin, as you and I both know painfully well, there is still, even in the year 2021, a stigma around women's masturbation. And we saw in COVID sex toy sales skyrocket, absolutely skyrocket. And honestly, that seemed like a great sign to me that women were not letting anyone shame them, who was around to shame them anyway, and taking things into their own, literally into their own hands during quarantine.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to, I feel like the term mortality salience and death salience has been coming up in a bunch of conversations lately, which don't know what that says about the conversations I'm having, but I think it's especially interesting to think about beyond just kind of this nesting urge. But when it comes more broadly to, again, we're making generalizations, for the 69% of men who felt closer to their partners, there's the 31% who didn't. But generally speaking, thinking about the client work that I've been doing, I've seen overwhelmingly people coming to talk to me about, like, I looked my mortality in the face, and the thing that I realized was that I was tired of not doing the things that I have always wanted to do. I'm tired of exploring things that I have always been curious about, or not exploring what I'm curious about, not having the kinds of relationships that I want, not having the kind of sex that I want, which I think was also borne out in the data, not just with things like sex toys, but also things like open relationships, exploring kink and BDSM. What do we make of that? I think that's beautiful. I feel like I see people who are really excited to embrace and step into pleasure in a way that, as you were saying with sex toys, Jess, feels like it's really a strong rejection of shame, for reasons that maybe seem morbid, right? Like, oh, if I'm going to die tomorrow, I want to have the sex life that I want to have. But morbid though it may sound, I think that's actually a pretty decent way to live.
Yeah, and I think there's something else at the root of it too, which is that the process that we've all been through in the past year and a half, and it's, for some reason, it's helpful for me to think of it as a process. Like, it was a phased experience that we all moved through together, and it's been one day at a time, one step at a time. But that process has made us all, whether we wanted to be or not, much more aware of our own emotional needs. That has just been forced upon us. Sometimes that's how progress works. It just forces itself upon you. And we all were more emotional. We were more vulnerable. We were scared. Everything was scary about the past year and a half, whether you were with a partner or not. And I think that's part of what we're seeing too. That's one of the driving forces I see behind this trend, is that, because women and men had to come to grips with the fact that we're emotional people and we have emotional needs. And that is something that a partner can really help with, is helping you feel safe, helping comfort you, helping you process things. I think that's part of why we're seeing this sort of like, I'm going to get what I want, I'm going to get what I need. And really it's because I think we all have a better sense of what we want and need now because of that emotional awareness. And for so long, men have been taught, to be strong, right? Whatever that was supposed to mean. And women were taught, don't seem needy, play games with him so it doesn't seem like you're too available. Both of which are messages that teach you to shut down your emotion, at least in a relationship or dating or, out there hooking up, what have you. So I see that as a really interesting driving force here.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of men, I'm hearing you just talk about how people are forced to be more emotional and vulnerable and scared. And I'm like, yes, absolutely, totally. And I'm thinking, Michael, of you saying earlier in this conversation that you couldn't get your guy friends to talk to you about their sex lives in a real kind of vulnerable or meaningful way. So what has that looked like? I mean, again, speaking very broadly and generally, but for the men in your life or the men in your audience.
Well, I can say that the survey, or us doing the survey, did not unlock anything with I guess the men in my social group necessarily. I do, the response that we did get from our readership though was one of again, real surprise. Interestingly, not about the relationship piece of it, not about people who are in relationships, but more about the sort of the lack of bacchanalia that we had anticipated would be happening. And I think that that's interesting to me because, again, and I think, Jess, you were the one, or maybe, I'm sorry, no, Haylin, you were the one who said that, the people talk a big game, right? But like when it actually comes down to it, are they actually going to put themselves out there and do that? They're saying, they're telling us in private that they're not. So I think that is something that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, one of the other things that our data pointed us to is that this could, despite all assumptions to the contrary, this could actually spell the end of the one night stand. Our survey respondents said they were less interested in having one night hookups than ever before, less interested in having simultaneous sexual partners in the same time period than ever before, that they'll take longer to meet someone in person, that they'll take longer to decide to have sex with that person, all of which points to, again, an interest in emotional intimacy, an interest in partnership. And one of the things that revealed to me and pointed to, thanks to a lot of our experts, is that this whole time period has led to a reassessment of hookup culture, and it's led to a reassessment of, I now understand what I need, or I have a better sense of what I need. Did hookup culture give me that? Did one night stands give me that? And it's funny, the young women I talk to these days are saying things like, I kind of felt like shit after that one night stand. Like, I'm glad I did it because I felt empowered and I felt like it was my right. But like, the sex wasn't good. And, like, he was sweaty and gross. And I just, deleted his number and I felt weird. And I think there's more of that sort of honesty coming to the fore, and truly a sort of an analytical look at the fact that hookup culture, one night stands, can feel very empowering, and I think are an important part of our sort of sexual history as modern people, but may not like deliver the emotional satisfaction or the sexual satisfaction that we're all looking for now.
Yeah, I will be totally honest. As a sexuality educator and as in a college, I also did a lot of alcohol and drug peer education. No one is doing as much of anything as they say that they are, and most of us are walking around assuming that other people are doing a lot more than they actually are. It's true when we're in high school and college. It's true when we are fully grown adults. The people who are the loudest are usually people who are doing the most stuff, whatever stuff is in this scenario. And also there's a lot of social incentive to, I mean, hey, those TikToks are funny. Like it's a cute sound to do a little dance to. You might go viral. What's not to like? I think as a health educator, especially, I think hearing people express that they're less interested in these fleeting encounters to me speaks not only to the fact that there are, I think, a lot of people who are realizing that those kinds of encounters weren't doing it for them in some regard, but also that, the pandemic has forced, to borrow the phrase from earlier, a level of awareness and engagement with conversations around risk assessment that as a sex educator feel like, uh, you know, as Michael was saying before, not to be Pollyanna-ish, obviously there are many more downsides than there are positives, but one teeny tiny silver lining to this is that I've had way less pushback from young people, college students most notably, around the idea that it is normal and cool to talk to your sexual partners about who else they're sleeping with, about the last time they got tested, about what kind of protection you want to use, because having those kinds of conversations about things like masks and COVID tests and vaccinations has made that more normal and made the stakes of it feel less like, I don't want to be embarrassed by bringing up this conversation, and more, I don't want to be irresponsible by endangering my health or my partner's health.
That's really interesting. I'm actually curious. In this role, I have seen some scary trends in condom use. When I first became editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan, one of our first feature stories was about the fact that statistics showed that use of condoms by young women was on the decline, which is not a good thing. And I am curious, Haylin, if you feel like you're seeing from your work that there's a correlation between like condom use and, talking about COVID status. Not to turn it back on you, but.
Not at all. That's a good question. I mean, part of it is confounded by the fact that I have not been doing any surveys. So all of the, data that I'm delivering is anecdotal. And I will also say that over the last year or so, I've been, the population of students that I'm working with and clients that I'm working with has all sort of shifted a lot. I haven't been in a high school classroom in over a year. I don't know what high school we're talking about. But speaking on the college students, again, in particular, that I've run workshops for or had conversations with about condoms specifically, or protection more broadly, it's a little bit of a catch-22. That's not the right phrase. Roll with me. Where on the one hand, people are a lot more open to and kind of feel entitled to have conversations about things like, have you been tested? Are you seeing other people? And unfortunately, it's like any other restrictive context. There are some people who are incentivized to lie. And there are unfortunately some people for whom the idea of, well, it's a pandemic, so obviously you're the only person, I'm the only person that you're hooking up with, you're the only person that I'm hooking with. We don't even need to really have the conversation about condoms because duh, it's self-evident. Again, I can't speak to it in terms of statistical numbers, but I will say that is not a story that I'm hearing from young people.
We should look out, Michael, you and I both should look out for statistics about condom usage after quarantine lifts, because that'll be really fascinating to see.
Yeah. One thing I would love to touch on is that I feel like one thing I want to make sure that we get across when we're talking about this survey, because we're talking about how the death of hookup culture, we're talking about relationships that are are stronger coming out of this, that people aren't cheating. I mean, it feels like, where's the drama? This is a conversation about sex, right? Like, let's get into that. And I think that, you know, the one part, the juicy part of the survey that was you know, pretty fascinating, is that the couples who were together during this time got more experimental. So I think that was one thing, you know, that was also pretty interesting inside of this survey, which was that even though maybe people don't want to hook up as much, you know, once this is over, or something like that, is that the people who are in relationships are kind of getting a little freakier.
Yeah, it is the funny thing about human sexuality. It's so tied to our nervous system and to our sort of internal sense of safety and regulation. So on the one hand, I've had a lot of folks talking to me about how they're like, my sex drive on March 13th of 2020, my sex drive just packed up and left, and I haven't seen it since. You know, because the level of stress going on was just, there was no way that they were going to be interested in having sex. Then there are people who have had, like you're pointing out, Michael, this experience of, well, actually, now that I have all of this unfettered time with my partner and just a lot of mental space to be creative, there is a level of security that comes from, if your home space is a really comfortable space to be, being in your home space all the time, being with someone that you're really intimate all the time. And that level of physiological safety, I always laugh when people describe themselves as like experimental or not experimental on a baseline, because it's not actually something static about our identities. As anyone who has had, you know, a whirlwind romance where they're like, wow, I have no idea why I was into that, but with that person, I was really into that. Yeah, because physiologically, your body responds differently to different kinds of sexual contexts. And I can imagine few sexual contexts or more compelling than, like, I'm with my person who I love and we don't have anywhere to go. Like, what's that Fifth Harmony song? You can work from home. Everyone's literally working from home. So,
you know, it's interesting too, you know, science and basically every study ever have told us that good sex is a contributing factor, a major contributing factor to a satisfying emotional relationship. And so another thing about it is that it's a form of relationship care. And, you know, again, what our data showed us is that couples felt closer, couples felt better and happier. And it can be a chicken or egg situation. Is that because they're having better sex, or is it, you know, are they having better sex because they're happier with each other, or because it's scary out there and they want to take care of each other? I think, you know, it's sort of a miasma of all of those things, but I mean, the end result is it's all good.
One of my favorite pairings of statistics that we got from this survey was that 40, I believe it was 43% of straight men claimed to be having more sex than the year before, and yet 31% of straight women claim to be having more sex than the year before. So even, you know, when it's science and we're doing a legit survey, I guess maybe guys are still just going to, you know, exaggerate their prowess or something like that.
Brag under
yeah,
the bleachers at school.
Yeah, exactly. Brag to the Kinsey people who are serving.
right. What's that high school rule of thumb that if a guy tells you his number, divided by 3?
I love that.
That's not, again, not scientific. That one comes straight from my high school students. Speaking of young people, I'm wondering, I don't know if this is something that was broken down this specifically in the data, but have you guys noticed differences in terms of age? Obviously, not talking about middle and high school students here, but you know, folks in their 20s, folks in their 30s, folks in their 40s, in how they're responding to or maybe preparing for the end of this last year.
It's, you know, obviously marriage statistics increase with age statistics. And so for the most part, the younger people in our survey set were the single people, and the older people in our survey set were the committed relationship people. And, you know, young people are talking a big game on TikTok right now about, as you say, like hitting the streets. And, you know, I think a lot about like college kids who have had to start a time in their lives that, you know, we all feel those of us who went to college, those of us who didn't go to college, there's this perception that the college experience is a rite of passage. And I think about these young people who have had the most warped version, and how, if I were a college sophomore this year going back to school in the fall, I mean, I would go all out and just like, parties, what have you. So, it certainly seems like young people are talking a big game about getting out there and having fun, and I'm sure that they will, and I hope that they do.
Yeah, I guess my fear and concern always, as the harm reduction person that I am, is like you know, whether or not things are happening in the open with lots of open communication, or again, this my like nightmare that keeps me up at night of like, are the kids, the youth, just going to be out here hooking up, under cover of night with their sneaky links and lying about what they're up to because they're photoshopping their COVID test or something horrifying like that. I mean, we're talking about sex and dating after the pandemic as though these are questions that we're ever going to not be asking. But at what point do we start talking about after? I mean, I'm vaccinated. I don't know if that means I'm post-pandemic.
Yeah, it's, I feel like today I was texting with my dad that the announcement from the CDC and then the follow-up from President Biden really sort of felt like the bell that we've been waiting for. I think we've all been waiting for some gong to go off that's like, it's the end. And today was the first time that, for me at least, it felt like that. I don't know how I feel about, I'll probably still wear my mask for a little bit and like try to get comfortable in this new existence. But like, effectively what we're being told at least is that it's here, it's now, it's today.
Yeah, I mean, Michael, you are the one panelist today who is not calling in from home. I can see that you're
I'm at the office today, not
in the office.
Inside, not wearing a mask.
Actually, Michael, if you turn around, we can wave at each other because I'm looking at you from my apartment right here.
Haylin, I actually have a question for you. Sorry to throw it back on you, but when we were talking about sort of the fact that people in relationships were getting more experimental, and one of the things that we found was a real uptick in the amount of people that were planning to pursue open relationships. And that, that's an interesting outlier to all of this, right? Which is that you want to stay with the partner that you experience this with, but perhaps explore things outside of it. And I'm just curious, anecdotally, in the people that you work with, that's something that you have seen or heard quite a bit of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's actually it's less contradictory than it might superficially seem. I think it goes quite in line with that broader trend of people just being more honest with themselves about their desires and seeking more intimate relationships. Intimacy and commitment is not an equal sign to monogamy. And for a lot of people, I think in that same way that mortality salience kind of brought them to awareness of other truths about themselves or their relationships or the world, that there were people, again, speaking anecdotally, I can definitely say, people who were also having that experience when looking at not just what kind of sex they were having, but how they thought about relationships more broadly, what kinds of relationships were fitting into their lives. I myself have identified for quite some time as a relationship anarchist. It's a really fancy way to get people kind of like all ruffled up of like, what does that mean? What's the relationship equivalent of a Molotov cocktail? To be clear, relationship anarchy is not anti-monogamy, but rather, I think, a perspective that I'm seeing more and more people express without using those words, which is, again, if I'm going to die tomorrow, I want to have the kinds of relationships that I want to have. It doesn't make sense to me that I shouldn't be able to have this kind of relationship constellation. I shouldn't be able to have this kind of relationship experience. And I think in a funny way, being kind of confined to having all of these virtual online interactions has accelerated that because, if you don't know a lot of polyamorous people, I lived in New York for 10 years. I saw every kind of relationship that there was. And I'm a sex educator. So I really saw every kind of relationship there was that was possible to have in my early dating years. But if you're not that person, you're not in that context, where do you even get the idea that that might be possible beyond, like, I don't know, what was that HBO show, Big Love, right? Like, if that wasn't your polyamory awakening, where are you going to have it? Well, you might have had it at some point in the last 12 months because there's an Instagram that you follow that has been posting really interesting infographics, or there's a Discord server that you joined and there's some, I don't know, what's that Twitter chat rooms one? There was some talk back they were having, and that opened up some doors. That's been happening not just with open relationships, but with really all these different areas of sexual exploration, self-exploration, I should say.
It's interesting. I think Michael and I take the, not to speak for you, Michael, but I can venture the guess that you and I both feel a major sense of responsibility in helping to surface these kinds of things. Like, that is our job, is to represent and to educate, is to tell people what's going on out there, to expose them to things they didn't know about, and things that broaden their horizons, to use a very cheesy term. I think that's a really important function of what we do, and I'm really proud of that work. I also think it's a really fascinating, vital, and beneficial function of a social platform like TikTok. You know, we've given TikTok a lot of airtime. This talk is not sponsored by TikTok. But I do think it's, you know, platforms like that, especially where your main feed is not controlled by what you subscribe to, but rather is an algorithm that's feeding you content that you wouldn't have otherwise chosen for yourself. I think the power of exposure that way is really interesting, and is, you know, we have TikToks as well for our brands, and we're educating in that space too. I just think what you say about exposure is really interesting and really important, and I think it's only increasing with time.
Hey, Haylin, did you describe yourself as a relationship anarchist?
I did.
Is
I did just sprinkle that one in.
That's it. Sorry, not to step on what, but and I know that you were kind of describing that. Can you describe that a little bit? What is a relationship anarchist?
Yes. So first of all, it's a great thing to describe yourself at a cocktail party, because everyone will immediately have a bunch of follow-up questions. So it is essentially, it's a relationship orientation. It's a framework for thinking about relationships that essentially says, I don't believe, I have to be really careful here, because I think people hear it and they immediately think, like, I don't believe in labels, you know, no such thing as monogamy, blow up the nuclear family, which is, you know, if someone wants to do things that way, that is certainly their right. My perspective is that I don't think that there is any categorical kind of relationship that I can have that automatically comes with a list of boundaries and expectations that my partner and I don't get a say so on, right? So whether that's a romantic relationship or a friendship, or what I have been cultivating in my life in the last few years, especially, which is a lot more romantic friendships, kind of relationship that I really like, because it was born out of my realization that I personally love romance. I'm a sucker for, like, romantic surprises, fancy dates, yada, yada. And to me, that is not something that I have to do with the person that I'm cohabitating with, sleeping with, you know, building a life with. And the person that I'm doing all of those things with doesn't have to be the person that is exclusively meeting my need for romance. And frankly, I have extraordinarily high needs for romance. I wouldn't want to put that on any one individual person, because that wouldn't be quite fair to expect of somebody. So, you know, again, it is not to say that I think people are often surprised to hear how monogamously I end up dating, oftentimes because I am a person who's also just functionally, like, I find it emotionally exhausting to carry on lots of emotionally intimate relationships. But that in and of itself, to me, is the essence of relationship anarchy. That the way that I build my relationships, I get to choose based on how I know myself to be, rather than saying, like, okay, society has given me this, you know, list of 10 categories of person that I'm allowed to have in my life, and I've got to fit all these people into those categories. Does that give a good, like, illustration?
It's funny. I think of a fuzzier version of that is a term that my features editor, the writer of this piece, Elizabeth Kiefer, she used at one point, which is monogamish. is what we see as something that people are interested in increasingly, and that feels akin to what you're describing.
Just bouncing off what Haylin said about relationship anarchy, and now I'm sort of like asking for the men in my audience, and I'm saying this at the risk of sounding like a terribly old man.
I love this already. I love it.
Well,
Yes.
I'm just curious. You know, your audience is very much young women, and I wonder, is relationship anarchy, is that something that is prevalent, more popular, the dominant sort of feeling when it comes to how young women go into relationships?
It's not the dominant. I would say it's increasingly on the radar, and that there's a lot of curiosity. I think, I hear a lot of questions, like, one that I'm sure Haylin gets a lot is, how do you handle jealousy, either yours or your partner's or any of your other, the other people that you're having different kinds of relationships with, like, how do you handle jealousy? I think there are a lot of questions. Interestingly, I think the sort of like dating industrial complex of the modern era is very much set up for a heteronormative monogamous relationship. Like, that's what all of the sort of, even though one could say that Tinder was a massive contributor to the rise in hookup culture, at least recently, the apps are all still sort of built to like introduce men to women, and under the guise, at least, of, we're looking for a committed heteronormative partnership. And so, it's interesting. I think some of those structures might need to change, and maybe they are and will, in order to support a little bit more exploration. But young women today are very incredibly confident. That's something that I think about a lot, especially in terms of Cosmopolitan. This magazine was founded by the inimitable Helen Gurley Brown, and she was working for an audience of women who lived in the country and hadn't yet moved to the city, mouse burgers, who needed to find their confidence. And the interesting thing about holding that role now is that I serve an audience of women who have found their confidence and who have, therefore, a whole other set of problems and questions. And so I think from that confidence, there's certainly more strength and safety in terms of like, I want what I want, and more individualism as a result of that.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to dominate the questions, but I have one more for you. And let me say that you could absolutely throw this question back at me if we were talking about masculinity, and you could say, well, Esquire has sort of been the one of the linchpins in the masculinity industrial complex, which is something obviously we think very hard about, and how we contribute to that, and how we now try to dismantle that in ways. But I'm curious then, if how does Cosmo fit into today the dating industrial complex?
That's a great question, and I very much appreciate it. We work very hard to make the magazine. It's you know what? I'm not going to say we work very hard to do it, because it's not hard work. It's natural to us, is to make the magazine much less heteronormative, much more open. We just did in our issue that's on newsstands now, we have an incredible health feature about getting good LGBTQ plus healthcare, because the healthcare system is not set up for LGBTQ plus folks, and it's actually quite difficult sometimes to get serious care, to get someone to take you seriously. And so it's honestly, it's an opportunity that my team and I really cherish, being able to rise to the occasion of, and to modernize this brand. I think both of our brands have evolved a lot over time, to reflect, the trends of the people who read them. And I do throw that question right back to you, Michael, about Esquire.
Well, I worry that it gets a little off topic, because we don't, our core mission isn't necessarily to speak to, yours has evolved beyond that sort of the sex and relationships component of it. But we're constantly interrogating aspects of masculinity, and, some parts of it are healthy and we reinforce that, and other parts are toxic and we try to take that apart.
Yeah, and I will say, I will say, for what it's worth, that a lot of the perspective of relationship anarchy, a lot of the really interesting and useful thought and writing that there has been around non-monogamy and just disrupting heteronormativity and patriarchy more broadly has, of course, come from queer sex workers, queer sexuality educators, queer thinkers who, by virtue of being de facto outside of heteronormativity, have had a wealth of creative and imaginative ways of reshaping relationships. So if anyone was really curious about the thing I was saying earlier, I would check out Designer Relationships. That's a good book to start with to kind of learn more about dismantling the concept of what a relationship is. Now that I have my anarchy plug out of the way, let's transition us over to some audience questions. There's a pair of questions that I see here that are sort of two sides of the same coin that I'd be interested to hear of your perspectives on. Someone asking, can you give some advice to people who haven't been dating for this whole year? Mm-hmm. And then also the question, what if you've become too reliant on your partner after having been with them every day for a whole year? How do you disconnect and find yourself again? So kind of same problem from opposite ends of the spectrum.
I'll maybe take the first part since I have been a single, and maybe Michael, you can take the second one. One of the things I loved hearing in the process of reporting this story is that Hinge is a very popular dating app. It's the app on which I met my boyfriend. And we spoke.
It's not sponsored by Hinge.
Not sponsored by Hinge. We spoke to the people at Hinge to get some insights from them, what was changing in their user patterns during COVID. And one of the things they told us is that a lot of their users reported to them that they were using the time of COVID to break their bad dating habits. And this is interesting to me because it shows that, the singles who want to get out there and find a partner actually mean it, at least I hope. People who would ghost in the past or just disappear without explaining why, tried to break that habit. People who maybe didn't, I'm thinking about, men who don't ask women questions and who rather just talk about themselves. Like that's something that people tried to stop doing. So as far as advice goes, I would say maybe expect a better dating pool than you had before, which is great for all of us. And B, I would think about that for yourself too. Like nobody's perfect. We all have habits or, biases, and like, what if you were starting fresh as your best possible dater? Like, what might you change about the ways that you handle certain things? I think it's respectful for us to ask ourselves those questions if the people that we're going out there to meet have also been asking themselves those questions. And ideally, you're sitting down at a cocktail table and you're more present than you have been in the past.
I'll take the second part of that question, and it's actually, I almost feel like, did I write that question? Because I definitely relate to that, and I've talked to people about that, and we've actually written stories about that very thing from the male perspective. And the advice we've gotten, the advice I've taken, the advice that I've applied is to give your partner encouragement and space, and to kind of expect that back. And just for example, now that we're free to go out in the world, or more free to go out in the world, is to encourage, I've encouraged my wife to go out with friends. I've got the kids, don't worry, we don't have childcare, that much childcare lined up at the moment, but don't worry, go out, spend the day with friends. She said the same thing to me, go out to dinners, go out for drinks, that kind of thing. And I think it's going to be a process. Jess, you talked about the process. You used that term earlier on. And I think that there is going to be a very strange kind of unwinding process. I mean, when I go to the office as I am today, I miss my wife, which is good to hear, but is also strange because how many years did I just go to the office and we said goodbye and we didn't necessarily miss each other? Because we hadn't been accustomed to spending every day with each other for the last year. So I think that there are a lot of people that I know that there are a lot of people going through that. And I think it's going to take time, and it's going to take effort.
Yeah, I think my advice to both of those groups of people, something that's been coming up a lot in my one-on-one work, but also in workshops a lot, is this idea of like thinking of yourself as an animal, like a human animal, and remembering that your nervous system is just really doing its best to try and keep you alive. That's its only purpose, uh, especially when it comes to attachment, co-regulation, intimacy with other people. You know, we're built to be social creatures, and we're built to have certain psychological patterns and habits when it comes to desiring intimacy, acclimating to intimacy, how it affects our, not just our mental state, but also literally our bodies. So if your body has been acclimated to one thing for a year, no matter what that thing is, there's absolutely going to be some amount of distress in changing that thing. If you have been single for a year and you've been working on yourself and even, you know, planning to get back out there, you may find, as I have found the first few times that I've interacted with people in public in the last few months, that you've completely forgotten how to interact with people. You've forgotten how to have a conversation, or you've forgotten how to like exist in space with other people and not be hyper conscious of, you know, well, how much is 6 feet and am I that far away from them?
Right.
These things will take probably as much time to unlearn as they did to learn, because again, that's part of this whole human animal bag. But especially those of you who are like pet people, I'm saying this as I'm looking at my beautiful cat napping right in front of me. You know, whenever I am experiencing some struggle of the human animal variety, to remind myself that, you know, I am literally an animal doing my best. So, to all of my fellow animals out there, whether you are struggling with missing the animal that you are partnered with, or struggling to feel like you are all alone in this world, to remember that both of those things are feelings that are coming from the part of you that is geared towards human connection. That is always a nice and beautiful thing, even if it is not always a pleasant thing to be experiencing.
Human animals, that's so wise.
It is good.
That's so wise. The thing too that I would say is just that about, you know, interacting with humans again is I've been shocked by the energy that it requires, which I guess I used to just function at that level all the time. And now I have to like crank myself into gear. I went and had lunch with my publisher the other day, which was like such a magazine thing to do. And I was so excited. And afterwards I came home and took a nap because I was so wiped. I was just wiped out.
Yeah, I 2 days ago I went on what was really the first in-person kind of business-related meeting, and it was only 30 minutes, and it was so nice. It was great, but it was also so strange and awkward. And I think the interesting thing was that we all acknowledged how awkward it was 2 minutes into that conversation. And I think that sort of let the air out of everything. And so it allowed us to all be kind of a little awkward and a little nervous about the whole thing. And by the end of it, it started to feel natural again. And just to your point, when I got home, I went to bed earlier that night than I had gone to bed in many, many, probably months.
Yeah, it is really tiring. I totally took for granted how like how much time I used to spend languidly walking through a Target or something like that. You know what I mean? Like just with all the carefree attitude in the world. And now I'm like, "Oh, I can't make eye contact with the end of this aisle. Oh, I gotta get out of here." Okay, I think we've got time for one last question. Let's see. Um, okay, these are also, I'm gonna sort of melange these two questions together because they're sort of the same question. So all these things that we've been talking about sort of put a bow on these trends and these sort of shapes of things that we're seeing moving. To what extent does this feel like a permanent, to the extent that anything is permanent, shift, or kind of a temporary blip that's gonna go back to normal?
It's so interesting. I marvel a lot at our collective ability to forget. Um, and I do think this is a period of time that many people will want to forget. And our brains are very powerful in that capacity. And so I would not be surprised if there is an eventual, you know, we all just sort of whitewash this past year and shift back into some old habits. But I do think there's good stuff here. And I think of all of the things, I think the relationship stuff and the emotional vulnerability stuff, I think that's the kind of thing that once you have, it's hard to give up. And so I hope those things stick. I really do.
I am going to disagree with you slightly, Jess. I think that this is a real pivot point that is going to fundamentally change. I think that these changes that we have anticipated will be generational. And I think that maybe after the span of a generation that things will change, or God forbid, there's another kind of tragic event that prompts it, or something along those lines. But I do think that this is going to be something that there's going to be a pretty clear before and after, and we're living through it right now, which is extraordinary. And we're going to be able to look back and say that that was a pivot point.
Yeah, I do think, I mean, if there's anything that this last month or so since vaccine distribution's been widespread has shown me, it's that things can change in every direction a lot faster than I thought was possible. But I do think I agree fundamentally with that assessment, Michael, that it does feel, I'll at least speak to the youths, since that's kind of a group that I've been working with young people since I was a young person. So I've got a little bit of a sense of scope. The kids are very much all right. I think there is something that has been sort of a layer of something that's been peeled away, or something that's been revealed, that that cat is sort of out of the bag and it's sort of hard to put back in, especially when it comes to having access to and feeling entitled to information about pleasure, the sex life that you want to have, the things that we actually deep down desire, but that maybe the hustle and bustle of everyday life made it easier to kind of sandpaper over. So on that hopefully optimistic note, I think that brings us to the end of our programming. Jess, Michael, do either of you have anything that you want to share, plug here at the end? Any parting words of wisdom?
This is so interesting to talk about, and I hope that thanks Camille for the clap. I hope that this is definitely a conversation that will continue as brands. Michael and I never really give up a story. We continue to follow it. So stay tuned. We'll update you as anything comes down the pipe that we think you might want to know about.
Yes, I'll just say that this has been so much fun. Thank you, Haylin, for running the show here, and thanks for having us.
Yes, of course. Thank you both for taking the time to sit down and chat with me. And if any of y'all in the audience want to hear me talk some more about sex, see more of my earring collection, How to Sex Toy is on Cosmo's YouTube channel, and you can check it out right. Yeah. All right, I guess that brings us to our awkward and unceremonious ending to the Zoom video, as it always is. I guess I will do a little cheers to ceremonially end our little happy hour. Thank you all again very much, and I'm sure I'll be chatting with both of you again sometime very soon.
Thank you, Haylin. Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for coming.